Okay, welcome to this meeting of the Local Plan Working Group on Wednesday, the 15th of June. Usual things, there were no fire alarms, mobile phones onto silent if possible. In terms of apologies, I've been notified by Councillor de Gorn. He's currently in a shareholders meeting and will come along if that finishes in time for him to come to this meeting. And Councillor Pearson phoned me to say he's running late on his train, so he will be here shortly, hopefully. Item 1 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Do I have any declarations of interest? Councillor Fisher.
Well, I'll declare an interest on the basis that I'm a chairman of a parish council which may benefit from community infrastructure levy. However, at the same time, we'd get section 106, so it won't prejudice my view.
And Councillor Cuthbertson.
Thank you, Chair. It's not a pecuniary prejudicial interest, but my wife and I are members of the Minster community, and I should make that clear before we vote on it. Thank you.
Okay. No further declarations of interest, in which case item 2 is the minutes of the meeting on the 7th of March. Is everybody happy for me to sign those as a correct record? Item 3, public participation. We have no members of the public registered to speak today, so I shall go straight to item 4, the Minster Precinct Neighbourhood Plan, and I'll hand over to John to introduce.
Afternoon, councillors. The purpose of this report is to outline the results of the Minster Precinct Neighbourhood Plan referendum, which took place in May, and ask members to recommend to Executive to formally make the Neighbourhood Plan and bring it into full legal force as a part of the development plan for York. This paper will be considered tomorrow at the Executive. Minster Precinct Neighbourhood Plan has been prepared by York Minster Precinct Neighbourhood Forum with ongoing engagement from local residents and community and City of York Council. The Local Plan Working Group on 7th of March and Executive on 17th of March, members accepted the examiner's recommendations and agreed that Minster Precinct Neighbourhood Plan, as so modified, should go forward to referendum. The referendum took place on Tuesday 10th of May at Bedden Hall in St Andrew Gate. The declaration of results of the poll are contained in Annex 8 of the report. 166 votes were cast, which was 21.4% of turnout, and the outcome was the yes votes 137, which is 83%, and no 28 votes, 17%. The neighbourhood plan regulations say that if the vote's over 50%, the council is legally obliged to make the plan. This must be made within 8 weeks of the beginning date after the first day after the referendum. And this would be by the 5th of July this year. The neighbourhood plan is considered to meet all basic conditions and all relevant legal and procedural requirements and is supported by the examiner's report. So the recommendations to the working group is to ask members to recommend to Executive that they consider the results of the referendum and formally make the plan, and to approve the decision statement attached to Annex B to the report in accordance with Regulation 19 of the Neighbourhood Plan Regulations 2012. Thank you.
Open up to the committee for any questions or comments. I should take that stunned silence as acceptance. I shall reserve my comments as I'll have to make the exact same ones tomorrow night anyway, so there's not much point in me saying it twice. So if everybody's happy to approve the recommendations at paragraph 2 on page 7. Thank you, John. And then we'll go over to agenda item 5, which is the introduction of the community infrastructure levy, and I'll hand over to Seb.
Thank you and good afternoon, councillors. So the report you have before you, sorry, is that better? So the report you have before you is in connection with the introduction of a community infrastructure levy for York. We're starting to consider this now. We're making progress with our local plan. We've got a good sense of where that development is, and we're starting to look at what are those implementation tools that we can use most effectively to make sure we're delivering the right type of infrastructure and in the right place. Now, at present, we of course use section 106. This is detailed in the report, along with the tests for the use of section 106, which are set out in the community infrastructure levy regulations, the SIL regulations, as amended. Still differs from section 106. It's a fixed and non-negotiable charge, and it's set out, it's charged per square metre of development. And the SIL regulations themselves are very highly prescriptive about the way you charge SIL. So exactly how you calculate it, exactly how you apply it to development, and indeed exactly how you set that SIL charge. That SIL charge, as you'll see in your report, needs to be set out in a charging schedule. That charging schedule is subject to an examination, and that examination considers two things. It considers, first of all, do you need a SIL? So can you justify it in terms of, is there a funding gap for your infrastructure? And can development viably support a SIL? So can development absorb the cost of a SIL? And because it considers whether development can absorb the cost of a SIL, you'll see lots of charging schedules that have differential SIL rates, whether it's by use or by area. So that's the kind of mechanisms that we need to go through to move forward with a SIL. And in the report, you'll see some details about how SIL can be used. So it can be used more broadly on infrastructure. And it's important to note, as set out again in the report, that it can be used alongside section 106. So if we think about developer contributions, so total pie, by introducing SIL, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, in some cases, if there's perhaps a very large development, you still might be seeking some section 106 on site, for example, to secure a school on site and a lower proportion of SIL within that total pie. But there'll be some developments where we don't currently get a section 106. I'm thinking particularly of smaller scale developments. And in those cases, the total development contribution would be sought through SIL. I'll pause there, Councillor. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, any questions, Councillor Pavlik?
Thanks. Yeah, really comprehensive. But I just wondered if you could go into a little bit more detail, and you mentioned it in your report, but also on paragraph 8 about this element of public examination and an independent by an independent person. Can you just go into a bit more clarity as to what that actually would be? Would that be for every single application? And is it like a public consultation or a public inquiry for every sale? I do have another question afterwards.
That's fine. I'll deal with that one first. It's absolutely not for every single application. What you do is you set out what those charges will be. That will be applied to all applications, non-negotiable. And then it's just that charging schedule itself, much like our local plan, that is subject to the examination. So that charging schedule will say things like this use is this X pounds per square metre. And the examiner will be examining that charging schedule, which is then applied to development.
Yeah. So my second question is around viability and viability assessments and how that is how that will impact on SIL. And as I think we all know, developers use a lot of different techniques to argue section 106, for examul, down on grounds of viability. What mechanism are the council going to use if this gets adopted into testing those viabilities? Is it the same as it would be for a section 106? Is it the public valuers, independent valuers office?
So again, in setting that SIL charging schedule and setting the charges that we want to set and reflecting those in our SIL charging schedule, alongside that goes two essentially main pieces of evidence. One is in relation to infrastructure that we need, as I say, and just demonstrating that there's a funding gap. And the other is a viability assessment. And we've got a similar viability assessment associated with our local plan. And what that's doing is looking at the costs of bringing forward development, the cost to developers, the developers bringing forward a reasonable profit, and that's defined actually in legislation that we have to consider that, and then saying, you know, what's an appropriate charge that won't push development to the margin. So in most cases, it's going to be acceptable, and that's really important, and it's scrutinised in the context of setting a SIL, because SIL is not negotiable. So in setting that charge, what we'll also be doing is taking account of what are we asking for through our local plan policies. So taking account of the level of affordable housing that would need to be provided, but also those other policy costs, and taking those into account in setting what the SIL charge should be. And as I say, that might lead to slightly different charges in different areas or for different uses.
So I suppose the knock-on from that, Sarah, is what likely impact might that have on affordable housing? For example, that point is they will argue the SIL, so they can't argue the SIL but they will look to argue and say, well, if we're having to pay the SIL, we can't then deliver 20%, we can only deliver 15%. Are we sure we can defend that position?
So, and that's a real cool part of the SIL examination itself, that examination of the charging schedule, because you've got to make sure that you can obviously deliver on the affordable housing ask. And that means oftentimes not pushing that SIL charge to the limit, to make sure that there is a degree of flexibility for different types of developments, the sort of abnormals that you might encounter in a place like York, to make sure that we're absolutely delivering the affordable housing. And that can be delivered at that testing phase alongside any SIL that we choose to charge. So that is very much a matter that will be considered in the context of the examination. And as an authority, no doubt, sort of reflecting on the questions that you've asked, we'd want to make sure that we're setting our charge at that level that doesn't put our affordable housing delivery at risk.
Councillor Doughty?
Thank you, Chair. It's an extension really of the same line of questioning. So bearing in mind that regardless of whether an independent inspector's deemed that whatever level's been is acceptable, it then becomes fixed and non-negotiable. How would the authority react then if a scheme came forward, but there was proper demonstrable evidence that the levy makes the development unviable, and the authority might want to make an adjustment themselves to ensure that whatever development that might be happens? What kind of flexibility would the authority have?
Okay, so I've got 2 points to my answer. The first is, you're absolutely right that, and I've said that SIL is non-negotiable, and obviously, yeah, well, not obviously, but affordable housing would still sit under section 106, which is negotiable. So the concern clearly driving those questions is, well, actually, will that push down on our affordable housing ask in that context? In theory, yes, it would, because one's negotiable and one is not. But in setting the SIL charge, what you want to do is be setting that SIL charge at a rate that wouldn't push the development into being unviable. And in the cases that you outline, it might be even without the SIL, given the cost of affordable housing being one of the larger development costs, that the development would be unviable anyway in those circumstances. So we'd be looking at setting the charge, working closely with our viability consultants who are very expert in these areas and will understand the market and understand some of these issues around affordable housing delivery, to make sure that we're not setting that charge, as I say, right at the limits that we might be prejudicing that affordable housing and on-site delivery.
So I'm not thinking specifically on housing necessarily, but it might be commercial developments, and specifically, obviously, we're trying to market York Central currently. So what potential effects could we see by imposing a set policy and potentially deterring some anchor development that would really want?
So the way the setting the SIL charge is structured, again, and I come back to the viability assessment. I'll come back to the viability assessment a lot, because that is essentially what drives your charge at the, sort of through this examination process and into adoption. So there might be instances that if viability is so low in any case, and we can only consider viability, we can't consider matters like, are we in policy terms, we want to attract a certain type of use. But in viability terms, it might be that certain types of development end up with a zero charge because there isn't enough value in that type of scheme anyway. And so it's not unusual, for example, to see a charging schedule that has charges sometimes upwards of 100 or much more than that in higher value parts of the country, but also charges that are levelled at zero because that type of use or that location is not viable to support the charge.
Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a few questions, if I may, and then I'll keep quiet. I want to ask if there's any examples of local authorities that might be similar to York in terms of size and geography and population who already have a SIL in place, and have they used it well? So, it'd be good just for us to have a look at that in around time, because this question on does it tip the balance too far on viability is one I'm a bit nervous about, because as things stand, developers are often saying you're asking too much of us. I mean, quite frankly, you'd have to question the business model as an entire concept, but that's a much bigger issue altogether. So I'm just wondering if we're on about not setting it too high to still make it viable for people, will it deliver meaningful gains if you're going the other way? So are there other local authorities that are doing this well? And if so, which ones are there?
Yeah, there are, because SIL has been operational for quite a while now, we have the advantage of looking at how other authorities have both set their SIL charge, although I would say, again, it's very much prescribed in the regulations, and so they'll be setting it in sort of looking at the viability appraisal in exactly the way that I'm defined, because we don't have room to kind of change that methodology and that approach to setting the charge itself. But we can certainly look at other authorities to look at how they've been spending and applying that money. I would highlight that areas with much lower values than you will have in York, in parts of the country with much sort of much less room, if you like, headroom in the actual values of development, have moved forward with charging a SIL. And that's because getting that money into a single pot offers you, I want to keep it in context as well, because it's still a small portion of money relative, say, for example, to the overall capital programme. But a single pot gives you a bit of more flexibility about the way in which you can apply that SIL to different projects, or seeking match funding, for example, to different projects. And there are lots of examples we can draw on around the country in that respect. It's probably worth also highlighting that I haven't seen an example of a SIL charging authority subsequently withdrawing their SIL after implementing it.
Okay, could you name like 2 or 3 places that we could look at ourselves in our own time?
I can, do you want me to come back to, I can circulate, just so I can give you some sort of meaningful examples in viability terms. It might just be helpful for me to have a proper look at values.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you just send that round? We'll try and get that appended to the minutes as well for the watching public who might want to look it up as well.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you. And I've just got a couple more, if I may, Chair. One is this neighbourhood contribution. Is that always 25% in all circumstances? Because I know there's the issue of parish areas, neighbourhood plans, and reading it, I'm assuming it is always 25%. But the part of the report that gets into areas that don't have a parish or a neighbourhood plan, it's not 100% clear.
Right, so again, the SIL regulations are highly prescriptive on the actual value, so we don't get to set those thresholds. So it's 15% of SIL receipts that are the neighbourhood portion of SIL.
Right.
And that's capped. There's a cap in the regulations, so whether there's a neighbourhood plan or not. And there's a cap in the regulations, and again, I could put perhaps that on the note as well, because there's quite a helpful diagram with some ticks and crosses in there in the planning practice guidance, which explains this neatly. And so 15% up to a certain cap, whether there's a neighbourhood plan or not. Now, if you're in a parish council, there's a mechanism now for that 15% to be transferred to a parish council. If you're in an unparished area, that you still get your 15%. The regulations absolutely provide for that, but it isn't transferred because there isn't a body to transfer it for, but there's still that engagement, and that's dealt with in the report as well. Now, where there is a neighbourhood plan, that percentage increases, and that percentage increases to 25%, and it's uncapped.
Nice. Well, that sort of leads to what was going to be my last question, which is, and I don't know if other people might be able to comment on this, but obviously the council are looking at this, the formal consultation hasn't started yet. Is there any early thinking on how the council might consult with areas that don't have a neighbourhood plan and don't have a parish? Because that could happen in a variety of ways. You could have an executive member and one officer saying, we'll use it in this way, or they might involve the ward councillors, or they might speak to a panel of community groups. I'm only asking because there is a lot of the city that doesn't have a neighbourhood plan or a parish.
Understood, and I've worked actually primarily in areas prior to joining York that were completely unparished.
Right.
So with respect to that, the report does indicate that we'd look at a policy approach to that, and that would be agreed by executive. But going to your previous question, there are quite a few good examples of different case studies and approaches, if you like, for the way that different authorities have approached that neighbourhood portion of SIL. So we've got quite a lot that we can learn from and draw on, but also looking at some of the sort of internal processes that you already have here in York that we might be able to build on and expand. I won't keep talking about this because we haven't done that thinking yet, but that thinking will come back to you should we decide as an authority and executive determine that we want to move forward with the charging schedule.
Cool, thank you. It might be a good item to have an economy in place, scrutiny further down the line if we get there. But thank you, and thanks for the report as well. I actually enjoyed reading it. Can't say that about many council reports. So.
I really love writing SIL reports. So.
There you got a knack for it.
All council reports are riveting, Councillor Taylor. You get suspicions of many of them, but I think that was an interesting question, because I think some of those people with parish councils have concerns about parish councils, and some of those without parish councils have concerns about not having parish councils. So it's not straightforward. And I'm guessing, is that 25% uplift for neighbourhood plans a little sort of nudge to encourage areas to move towards the neighbourhood plan process?
Absolutely. So encourage that, but also just to create more of a link for people in localities and with the development in their area and seeing some of those benefits. It's covered in the report, but the SIL community infrastructure levy is to be used on infrastructure, the main portion of it, but that neighbourhood element can be spent a little bit more widely on infrastructure. Still has to relate back to development, but it can be spent more widely on infrastructure, and that's led to lots of different and interesting projects across the country to respond to that development and to work with communities to find the type of response that they want in their locality.
I think Neil wanted to come in.
Just picking up on Councillor Taylor's point there, it might be a recommendation that the local plan working group want to make to executive, because the policy piece associated with unparished areas is a matter for the executive to determine how they're going to effectively decide on that distribution. So it may be that you want to make a recommendation from this group to executive to ask economy in place scrutiny to provide input into the autumn decision on to executive. But a matter for you to consider it as members, but clearly that's not the prescribed part of the regulations. It's the bit that the executive determines. It's got to be spent in the locality, as Sarah's explained, but how it's determined in the locality, because there isn't a statutory body in that area, will be a matter for the executive to determine.
Is that on this point, Councillor Fisher, or is it just on a more general point? Okay, I'll begin this point then.
Yeah, what worries me a little bit is about how an unparished area would actually get around to making a neighbourhood plan to benefit from the higher level. My parish started a neighbourhood plan in 2016. We've spent about £35,000 on it, which I think only about £15,000 has been replaced, and the parish council has funded the rest. It does worry me. Have we got a mechanism in place to enable areas without a parish council to actually generate a neighbourhood plan and fully fund it? Because obviously, if they haven't got a parish council, there's no source of funding from them.
I would suggest that that's a matter for, because clearly this is going to be a matter for executive to determine how the 15% is distributed in non-parished areas, but it could be an extra consideration and for the scrutiny, and then subsequently executive to consider, well, how does it facilitate those non-parished areas to lift themselves up to get a neighbourhood plan? Because clearly, as Sarah's outlined, communities actually taking an interest in and engaging in the development in their areas is something that helps sort of bring democracy and also community engagement to the people. And this does give you a really good feedback loop in terms of an incentive there to do it. So one again for members to consider as a council, and then ultimately make recommendations to executive.
And while somewhat unique, obviously, agenda item 4 here is an unparished neighbourhood plan. So we haven't managed to get one through in particular circumstances, but it will be more challenging in other areas. Councillor Lomas.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Councillor Fisher, I share the concern. However, before I was elected as a councillor, I was secretary to a neighbourhood forum in an unparished area where we worked really hard to become established as a neighbourhood forum, which unlocks the door to funding to support the work that is needed in order to produce your neighbourhood plan. So absolutely, there is mechanism already in place for unparished areas. I think what is needed is some support for those groups who come together and want to start the process before they can get recognised as a neighbourhood forum and unlock the funding. There's work for them to do to get to that place. And I think that it's that step where the funding is lacking. It's not a massively expensive piece of work to do. A lot of it is just making sure that people in the area that you're looking at know what's happening and have the chance to feed into it, up to the point at which you get recognised. And we were lucky as a group. We had some local funding of, you know, a couple of £100 was all we needed in order to get to that place. And that was really just to support communicating with people and organisations in the area.
I do wonder, Neil, if people haven't been traumatised too much by the process, whether actually we've got quite a few neighbourhood plans through now, if those individuals might be interested in actually visiting some of those areas and actually giving information and advice to people on how they did it and what the process might be, rather than necessarily. I wonder if the skilled officers who might not have the same sort of experience as an individual as a volunteer trying to get through that process, if we could try and coordinate something like that as well.
I think certainly the forward plan team has had close working relationships with lots of communities, as you said, and they, you know, really appreciated, and we've seen report after report where recommendations to executive have applauded the work of community groups. And I think you know, absolutely there's opportunities for learning within the community, and which we can propagate. I think there is also the piece that Councillor Lomas, the point you make there about the small C-Cod funding needed to then work towards a forum. Clearly under the current arrangements, there is opportunity for ward funding to start that snowball rolling, as it were. And it's maybe something, again, executive and economy and place scrutiny might want to consider, is making a general request of all I just want all ward councillors to consider promoting.
And I can probably perhaps think of one or two parish councils that we might not want to invite to do those talks, as they might persuade everyone to never go near it at all. But Councillor Pavlovich, I think you had indicated earlier.
Thanks, Chair. Is there any bodies that are excluded from having to pay a sale? So, for example, if it's a local authority application, or if it's a government body, such as Homes England, that have the application, are they exempt from having to pay a sale?
No.
Great.
But there are exemptions provided for in the regulations related to charitable uses, for example, and affordable housing.
Yeah,
So
I saw that. It was just about formal bodies. So they would essentially be negotiating. If it was a local authority scheme, it would be negotiating with itself.
It would just, there's no negotiation, so it would just pay itself.
It just pay it, right? Yeah, great.
Councillor Hollier, I thought you were indicating earlier, but I wasn't sure. You've not made eye contact with me for the last 15 minutes. So I'm going to put you on the spot now. So you have to think of a question if you didn't have one.
I did try earlier, and it was about the percentages, 25, 7, 15, etc., which has largely been answered. But what I'm taking away is that if I happen to have a ward with potentially 700 houses being built to the north of it, that the difference in value to local community between having a neighbourhood plan and not having a neighbourhood plan is about sort of £1 million. If it's 700 houses, £130 a square metre, 100 square metres a house. The difference between 25 and 15% is a lot of money, so definitely worth them finishing the plan.
Well, there is the number that's 25% is different to uncapped is different to 15%, of course. But in terms of the scale of development, we could look, of course, at the scale of development we're getting in the city. And I'm just thinking about our plan allocations. There aren't a very large number above that sort of threshold. And again, I think still offers useful additionality. So, always quite cautious. It takes a little while to build up. And then also relative to your wider capital programme, it's a relatively modest stream compared to some of the other funding streams available. Notwithstanding that, I think it is it provides useful additionality. Yeah,
it will do for the parish council.
Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. I know I said I'd already asked my questions. I've just got one more, which is It's about, basically, I read this report and I thought, why wouldn't we want to do this? Why wouldn't we want to proceed? And it's the only possible risk that if we start proceeding with this, the government might surprise us and get their replacement model of this up much sooner than we currently expect them to. And therefore work is wasted.
I will reserve comment on this government doing anything quickly and efficiently, but I'll pass it over to officers to answer.
That is something that we considered, and you can see that's one of the options, alternatives that we looked at in the report, to almost wait for the new mechanism. But I think there are two things about that. There's a bit more detail that we have now in the emerging, I've got what's called the Levelling Up and Planning Bill. I possibly got that wrong way around, so I won't have to open my laptop again. But in that, they're articulating what this new levy, called the infrastructure levy rather than the community infrastructure levy, would look like. And I think there are two relevant points. Again, these are covered in the note. So first of all, it's a levy type mechanism. So we'll still be, there's some differences with the way it's charged. It's charged on end values and uplifts, but you're still ending up with a pot of money to spend on infrastructure, and you still retain those neighbourhood elements. So all of the much harder work in some respects that we do around governance, how we're going to allocate these funds, how we're going to make sure development is properly supported by infrastructure, right time, right place. That work is necessary in a levy context, however that levy is charged. The second point I'd note is the government announcements have been, as it relates to the new infrastructure levy, have described it as a test and learn approach. The indication being that the government is going to move quite slowly, potentially from learning on the back of the introduction of the community infrastructure levy. This test and learn approach, which suggests a slower introduction, so maybe paced introduction, even if it does become mandatory down the line.
So we might as well get on with it then, eh? Thanks.
I think Neil wants to go on that point.
Yeah, I think I would agree with your final comment there, Councillor Taylor. I think the piece at the moment is the evidence base to generate the SIL being the viability appraisal, and then that public inquiry. Sarah and the team who are leading the local plan through its process are having to do a huge amount of detailed work at the moment to make sure that the viability on a site-by-site basis continues to be robust in the local plan process. So we've got now's the time when we've got a really robust evidence-based viability appraisal happening anyway, and that will be a big constituent part of the work that Sarah and the team pulled together for the SIL process as well. So it's demonstrably current, it's demonstrably appropriate that viability appraisal is a robust, and now's the time to do it, which is why this report is coming forward at this point in time.
I suppose my knock-on question to that, Sarah, is there is no development without infrastructure. So if you don't deliver it via a SIL, what would be the alternate mechanisms to deliver the infrastructure that you actually needed to deliver that level of housing? There. So it's,
sorry, Chair. Thank you. It's the status quo, so we'd continue to use Section 106 in the way that we do until such time potentially as it's replaced by this new levy type mechanism.
So
anyway,
kind of getting that across that it's not a new thing in addition, that it would be funded by a different mechanism. It's not an additional levy, as well. Councillor de Gon.
Yeah, but just to clarify that once you've got this in place, I mean, obviously over time, things like the local plan will be subject to review. Would the SIL be reviewed in line with a local plan, or if you found that what you'd adopted in terms of values and so on were not still fit for purpose, is there a sort of review mechanism for that?
you can elect to review your SIL charging schedule as a charging authority, so you could choose to do that alongside the plan. And I won't go into the detail of the new infrastructure levy, that's down the line, and the detail is being worked through, so you can certainly do that. It's also important to note that the community infrastructure levy itself is index linked in the way it applies. As you see, many Section 106 agreements are also index linked, so there's a degree of responsiveness built in to those economic changes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else indicating, so I'm getting the impression that we're reasonably happy with the recommendations on page 23 at paragraph 2, with the addition, I believe, that Neil alluded to on the back of Councillor Taylor's comments, that it'd be recommended to executive that that particular area around unparished areas is put through economic scrutiny prior to any decision being formally taken. Are we happy to add that as a recommendation? In which case, with those amended recommendations, are we all happy with forward to? Okay, in which case, I have no urgent business. So, Councillor Pavlik, are you going to sing happy birthday? Is that?
Oh, God, yes, absolutely. No, I was just wondering, are we going to get an update on the local plan hearing process? Because we're now into, we're about to start phase 3. We'll be moving into phase 4. Is there any update planned for this committee?
We can either do an impromptu update now, or we could give you a separate update in a later date in the forum of your choosing. It's just we haven't actually prepared an update for today.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I mean, it may be worthwhile waiting until the comments from phase 2 come in, but once those are in from the examiners, it might be really worthwhile us as a committee just considering where we're at.
Happy to have a chat with the vice chair outside of the meeting, and just how I might do that. Is that okay? Okay. Okay. I'll reclose the meeting. That was reopened by Councillor Pavlik. I was in the middle of saying it. Okay. Thank you, everyone.